All right. We are live from Occupy City Hall. We are going to begin conducting or continuing the Rockford reading segment that we do out here. The book that we're reading right now is In Defense of Looting, A Riotous History of Uncivil Action by Vicky Osterweil. We're outside of City Hall in Rockford, Illinois. We came out here on October 3rd, 2020, after on October 2nd, 2020, Tyrus Jones was shot by the Rockford Police Department by Officer Dominic McNeese while he was running away. Our occupation continued through the end of November when Officer Dominic McNeese will be found justified in the attempted murder of Tyrus Jones and will return back to work. Our occupation will continue through January 5th, 2021, when Denzel Duvant would be assaulted by the Rockford Police Department while he was handcuffed. One of the officers involved in that assault would be Officer Dominic McNeese, the officer that just 3 months prior attempted to murder a black man by shooting him while he was running away. There would be no investigation and no reprimand for any of the officers who were involved in the assault of Denzel Duvant. Our occupation will continue through April 10th, 2021, when Faustin Guaitigo was murdered inside of his home by Winnebago County Sheriff Deputy Joseph Brulard. Our occupation will continue when no more than 24 hours later, Jose Gonzalez Jr. was shot while running away by Rockford Police Department Officer Owen McGinnis. And our occupation will continue through April 25th, 2021, when Raymond Jackson died after a high-speed pursuit took place involving the Rockford Police Department in the streets of Rockford, Illinois. Raymond Jackson would die after his car was collided into by the car being chased by the Rockford Police Department. Raymond Jackson would die, and his children would be in critical condition after that accident took place. And again, high-speed pursuits, for people who may not know, are considered uses of deadly force, and we live in a city which has had regular occurrences of high-speed pursuits leading to the death of innocent lives, or to the costing us innocent lives. So we want to say justice for Tyrus Jones, justice for Denzel Duvant, Guaitigo, justice for Jose Gonzalez Jr., and justice for Raymond Jackson. All five of those people were victims of the police terrorism issues that we have out here in the city of Rockford, Illinois. So what we're going to do is, for anybody who has maybe not watched this segment before, is we'll go through and we'll read portions from this book, In Defense of Looting. And as we're going through and reading, we'll stop periodically to have conversations and have dialogues about the issues presented. Reconnecting. All right, there we go. When it comes to the issues of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. All right, we're going to start on page 39. We got somebody who's going to offer some extra thoughts on what we're reading as we read through this here today too. You got to at least say one thing before you leave. You can't even dip off, so you done started, or it's gonna look weird for you to just be here and not say nothing. All right, so I'm gonna read a little bit, and then I'm gonna say something about what I read, and then you chime in after that. All right, I'll pass you the mic. Okay. Chapter 2, Looting Emancipation. Who freed the enslaved? Any school child can tell you it was Abraham Lincoln. Most adults would agree, perhaps adding that it was the Union fought for in the Civil War. The social revolution in the South that ended slavery might have been impossible without the Civil War and the Union Army, and it's true that the legal end of chattel slavery was brought about by Lincoln in the 13th Amendment. But it was despite the intentions and desires of Lincoln in the North, not because of them, that the enslaved achieved emancipation, dragging Lincoln and the Union Army kicking and screaming behind them. The enslaved freed themselves. They did so with an act of mass looting and strike that shook the regime of white supremacist capitalism to its core. They stole themselves from their masters and, in so doing, abolished a huge percentage of America's wealth. A wealth, according to historian David Rodiger, quote, equal to the combined value of all capital invested in manufacturing, railroads, and banks, as well as currency in circulation in all federal expenditures, end quote. Almost entirely illiterate, forcibly barred from gathering and organizing, ostensibly kept ignorant of current events, they nevertheless recognized, well before the planters who enslaved them or the Union generals who would be the instruments of their liberty, what opportunity the Civil War really held. Jubilee, the end of slavery, and the coming of their emancipation. They took it. Though we may question it and struggle against it, our default sense of history, like our default idea of politics, is a story of leaders, laws, and wars, important dates, and formal treaties. Such a historical lens can't help but misrecognize the political will and communal intelligence behind the massive, decentralized, direct actions that mark all revolutionary moments. Instead, 500,000 enslaved persons escaping in the span of 4 years is treated like some individualistic, apolitical phenomenon called, quote, opportunism, end quote, a crime rioters and looters are always accused of. The history of the Black Atlantic, however, reveals that enslaved populations across the centuries have always recognized political crises among their enslavers as the best moments to organize and get free. The most famous example of this, of course, is the Haitian Revolution. News of the French Revolution's beginnings in 1789 sent the French sugar colony of Saint Domingo into turmoil. While different political factions struggled both in Santo Domingo, and in the Revolutionary National Assembly back in Paris, the enslaved workers, the vast majority of the island's population, watched, waited, and formed a plan of revolt. On the night of August 21st, 1791, the enslaved rose up in a coordinated and furious attack and, within 10 days, have burned dozens of plantations and taken over the entire northern province of the colony. These masses would eventually form great armies, overthrowing the colonial government and taking over the island. By 1804, after defeating the colonial government, the Spanish, the British, and Napoleon Bonaparte, the independent black nation of Haiti had been established. The Europeans and the United States have never forgotten this history of liberty at their expense, and the tiny country of Haiti, the result of the first victorious anti-colonial and anti-slavery struggle in the Americas, has been punished by economic sanction, debt, invasion, war, boycott, and neo-colonialism ever since. Okay, so I'll stop right there and then reflect on these last two pages that we read. And so I think one of the main things to point out in this is opposed to what is usually taught in high schools and middle schools, and opposed to what is usually shown in movies or TV shows, the Union of America did not want to end slavery. Abraham Lincoln did not want to end slavery. It was not the reason that the Civil War began. The Civil War began in an effort to keep the country together, to keep the Union together. And it was in the midst of the Civil War that the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and that was in an effort to try to weaken the Southern Army, to try to weaken the Confederate Army more than it was to free the slaves. I think also another thing that isn't spoken about enough is how many slaves right before the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, how many enslaved people escaped the plantations. And that was another one of the things that was leading to forcing the hand of the country to free the black people and free the Africans that were in the country, is that more and more of them were escaping the plantation and coming to the north and speaking about the cruelties of slavery and speaking about the cruelties of things that they experienced. And also what has to be remembered is that when people were escaping the South and going to the North, that it wasn't just that they were losing slaves. They were losing property. They were losing employees and workers. And so each time that these groups of slaves would leave the plantation, that would be a money loss for the plantation. So all of these things were weakening the institutions of slavery and forcing the hand of Abraham Lincoln to signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And then again, another thing that isn't taught as anywhere near as often as it should, or spoken about as often as it should, is the revolution that took place in Haiti. The Africans that were being enslaved in Haiti all fought back. They organized and they won their freedom. They fought back for their freedom, and that's a story that usually you hear a lot about upended slave revolts. You don't hear a lot about the slave revolts that were successful. And the Haitian slave revolt was one of those. So what about you? In school, when you go to school, do they tell you that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves? That's something that they say? Right here, you got to talk to them.
I feel like in school, like definitely being in middle school, they don't show like enough about like slaves, and they just like do like the little simple stuff. I feel like they need to like expand it more, and like even the teachers, they need to like tell the kids more about it. I feel like they just show little 5-minute videos about it. Like they need to expand about like what was actually going on, so that like, especially being a black kid, like you need to like actually know that stuff.
Anything else? What about Haiti? Had you ever heard about Haiti before?
No, no, never. Not in school. No.
What about? Have you ever heard about Nat Turner? You ever learned about Nat Turner in school?
No.
What about Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass. They talk about Frederick Douglass in school.
Barely. Only in like little simple videos, like 5-10 minute videos.
What about George Washington? You hear a lot about George
Washington? Yeah.
What about Abraham Lincoln? You hear a lot about Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah.
Talks a lot about the white presidents. You gonna keep going or you done? You finna go right out? You riding now? Okay, go be a kid. Go ahead, enjoy being a kid. That's good. The kids, let the kids leave. Now I can smoke this blunt. Y'all be safe. All right, I'm gonna holler at you. Okay, let's see. We're gonna pick up at the bottom of page 41. Again, we're on chapter 2 of In Defense of Looting. This chapter is called Looting Emancipation. So let's continue through here. Okay. But it wasn't only Haitians who used political conflict to break their bonds. The overthrow of the July monarchy in 1848 and the rise of the Republic of France saw an abolitionist government installed in Paris. Though this new government would formally abolish slavery in the remaining French sugar colonies, the enslaved of Martinique did not wait for Paris's help. They deserted plantations in the thousands, forcing the colonial administration of Martinique and Guadeloupe to abolish slavery before the order from the new government to do so could arrive across the Atlantic. In the United States, meanwhile, as many as 100,000 people, near 20% of the colonial slave population, escaped slavery during the course of the American Revolution, including some slaves of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, fugitives who no doubt had a more expansive idea of freedom than their enslaving founding fathers, making it the largest slave revolt in the United States history until the Civil War. The American Civil War is large, and I think, just want to point out here again, this is just a reminder that Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, these men should not have schools named after them or buildings or institutions or streets named after them. These men engaged in slavery. These men were humongous hypocrites while writing that every man was entitled to unalienable rights and every man was entitled to freedom. They were holding slaves and engaging in slavery. Thomas Jefferson even raping his slaves and enslaving his own children. So let's continue. The American Civil War is largely remembered as a clash of armies, but its historical meaning and significance were mostly determined by a strike of the slaves. The enslaved rose up, fled the plantation, picked up arms to destroy their former enslavers. Oh, wait, hold on. Excuse me. The American Civil War is largely remembered as a clash of armies, but its historical meaning and significance were mostly determined by a social revolution in the South, what W.E.B. Du Bois called the, quote, general strike of the slaves, end quote. The enslaved rose up, fled the plantation, picked up arms to destroy their former enslavers, and took history into their hands. The fight for emancipation in the United States did not begin in the Civil War, and neither did it end at the war's conclusion. The fugitive escaping slavery is as old as the colonies. Her history is necessary to understanding the course of and possibilities for revolution in the United States. Similarly, the Confederate Army did not spring from thin air, but evolved from what Du Bois called the, quote, armed and commissioned camp to keep Negroes in slavery and to kill the black rebel, end quote. The proto-police state, the antebellum white South became after the Revolution. Nor was this armed camp destroyed utterly in the crucible of war and defeat, but rather reformed itself as the white vigilantes and police forces, themselves often indistinguishable, of the following Reconstruction and Jim Crow eras. The white industrialist North, labor and management alike, had gone into the war not to abolish but to contain slavery, and thus black people, in the agrarian South, and it would continue afterward to attempt to restrict black movement and resist black migration north and westward. White people, North and South, thus, united after the war to maintain what theorist Saidiya Hartman calls the, quote, tragic continuities in antebellum and postbellum constitutions of blackness, end quote. These continuities would mean, after a brief and often revolutionary interim known as Reconstruction, such economic, social, and political oppression that Frederick Douglass, in 1888, only 11 years after the end of Reconstruction, would denounce emancipation as a quote, stupendous fraud, end quote. Still, despite these bleak facts, the decades of the Civil War and the self-emancipation of the enslaved are a crucial hinge point in American history. The violent collapse of slavery dramatically accelerated a series of economic and political transformations already underway. A market driven by the rural production of agricultural staples giving way to one driven by urban industrial outputs. Political power shifting from south to north and west, from planters and merchants to bankers and industrialists. The results of these changes will form the cornerstones of the modern American state. More important to our story and the possibility of revolution in America is the legal and ideological transformation of black people from slaves into criminals, the formal transition of slave patrols into police, and the increasing organization of black people in America as a political, social, and revolutionary force. In the center of all these transformations is the fugitive slave. Winning her emancipation singly in groups and in mass, stealing through dark swamps and across busy roads, dodging the slave catchers and outwitting police patrols, she moves unseen on the edges of history, changing it inexorably with her flight. To find herself, she must steal and abolish white property, must abolish herself as property. She strikes fear into the heart of white society because she reveals just how flimsy their regimes of property, power, and domination can be in the face of her jailbreak for freedom. This specter of slaves freeing themselves is America's history's first image of black looters. And then it's some matchsticks. It's like 3 matchsticks, and I think that's like to signify a new topic sort of in the midst of this chapter. So I think that's a good place to sort of stop and have a small reflection. One thing I want to say is that I'm happy that we had some guests here at the beginning of reading this, and happy that they chimed in. I think that's something that we want to get to more often, is doing some of these Rockford readings and having multiple voices here, and hearing what some of these things, what people's thoughts are after, what multiple people's thoughts are while reading through some of these things. And so let's sort of just reflect on a multitude of the things that were just in that first portion of the chapter. Sorry, y'all. My eye's itching me. I want to make sure that this audio is right too, so excuse me as I do that. But I'm just want to make sure this audio is right. As I do that, let me say this. I think that first off, I love the concept. First off, I love the concept that is being that's being expounded upon as the black, since the black body was considered to be property, the black human beings were considered to be property in America, not considered to be humans in America. The running away, the stealing away of those people of their own property, of people who were running the Underground Railroad, for example, Harriet Tubman coming and bringing people away, to consider that running away to be looting, to expound upon the fact that since they weren't considered to be humans, that them running away was less, in some manner or another, less of an employee leaving and more of the property being taken away, along with the employee leaving as well. And so I think that concept of looting the body, looting freedom, is something that is very poignant and is very philosophical. And I think that it sort of gets to the root of why black people as a whole, when certain moments of history has arisen, why looting has not been something that black people have been shied away from, or looting has not been something that, or looting has been something that has maybe been attributed to black people as well. And again, this is loud ass fucking motorcycles. Nah, I don't got nothing against motorcycles. It's just, that's a statement of a fact. That's a fact. It's a loud ass motorcycle. But in this portion here, where this specter of slaves freeing themselves is America's first history. This specter of slaves freeing themselves is American history's first image of black looters. To me, that is a very poignant sentence. I think when I reflect back to the first time that I have seen black people be considered to be looters in American history. When I was younger, maybe 11 or 12, is when Hurricane Katrina took place and when Hurricane Katrina happened. And I remember the vast difference that would be attributed to white people in the midst of Hurricane Katrina, trying to get items that may be helpful for them dealing with this natural disaster that was going on. That would be the way they would be painted would be vastly different than how black people would be painted doing the same things. Black people would be called looters very regularly in the midst of what went on in Hurricane Katrina. So from that, my first experience was not with any type of riot or with any type of revolution going on and black people being considered to be looters in certain aspects. My experience was with a natural disaster going on and black people trying to find items that would prolong their lives, that could the diapers and food and drinks and things of that nature, and they were being called looting. Even in that sense. And then also I think that Reconstruction is brought up briefly here, which I think is another very important moment in American history when it comes to the struggle for black liberation. And it's another important moment in American history because you see the manners in which, and we spoke about this on one of the previous lives, Rockford readings, where America has this tendency to take 2 steps forward and take 1 step forward and take 2 steps back, or even sometimes take 2 steps forward and take 1 step back, or take 2 steps forward and take 4 steps back. And Reconstruction was one of those things. This is the first time I've ever heard Frederick Douglass called the Emancipation a stupendous fraud before, but that gets back to a reoccurring theme with certain black freedom fighters. At the end of Dr. King's life, he talked about how it was possible that they were too optimistic during the early 60s when some of the civil rights struggling was going on, and how towards the end of his life in 1968, he spoke about how it was time for more of a realism and a realistic way of looking at some of these things because some of the false optimism had led them astray. And so again, this is this regularity in which black freedom fighters, people involved in the struggle for black liberation towards the end of their lives have seen regression about things that they once seen progression on. Yuck, somebody with the Blue Lives Matter flag. And then I think that makes me want to expound upon right here where it says, more important to our story and the possibility of black revolution in America is the legal and ideological transformation of black people from slaves into criminals, the formal transition of slave patrols into police, and the increasing organization of black people in America as a political, social, and revolutionary force. And I think that is that sort of ushers you into the difference between that sort of ushers you into where we stand now with the new Jim Crow, where it ushers us into where we stand now with the new Jim Crow being mass incarceration, where black people went from being, and it's not pointed in here, but there's almost 3 portions of it. It's the black people being synonymous with slaves and slavery, black people being synonymous with segregation and being segregated and almost being a second-class citizenship. Being black was a second-class citizenship, and then to now where we are at now, with black people being seen as criminals and being black has that connotation. And those are sort of the 3 main stages that having black skin has had in this country. And it's important that we understand that if we're in an effort to try to break that category, because it was broken, the slavery, black being synonymous with physical bondage slavery, with chattel slavery, and then it became second-class citizenship, and now it is criminal. And so again, these are just some of the thoughts from going through and reading in defense of looting and Here, let's continue going forward. All right, we're on page 43. In describing the let me actually my fault. I just want to share. I'm gonna share this video. I just want to make sure that this is make sure the audio right. Audio right? I think it is. Yeah, okay. Audio all good. All right. Okay, my fault. Okay, let's get back. In describing the organized freeing of the enslaved as, quote, looting, end quote, I am committing an anachronism. Okay, we're gonna look up the definition for that. And this is something that we should do more often. Whenever you read, you should look up the definitions of the words. Sometimes when I'm running through on here live, I'm not doing it, but let's look up the definition of this. Anachronism. A noun, a thing belonging or appropriate to a period other than that which it exists, especially a thing that is conspicuously old-fashioned. An act of attributing a custom, event, or object to a period to which it does not belong. Okay. That makes sense. As we saw, loot does not appear as an English word until 1845, and the word looter first appeared in 1858. Nevertheless, it is easy to imagine that Nat Turner, John Brown, Harriet Tubman, and other revolutionaries, already referred to as robbers and criminals, would have been called looters, for they were engaged in nothing less than the open, organized, and criminal expropriation of white property. The enslaved themselves, more than their putative masters, the enslaved themselves, more than their putative masters, even described what they did as stealing. As Sadiah Hartman writes, quote, when the enslaved slipped away to have secret meetings, they would call it, quote, stealing the meeting, end quote, as if to highlight the appropriation of space and the expropriation of the object or property necessary to make these meetings possible. Just as runaway slaves were described as, quote, stealing themselves, end quote, so too, even short-lived, quote, flights, end quote, from captivity were referred to as, quote, stealing away, end quote. As Hartman analyzes, even, quote, small, end quote, acts of liberty and pleasure, such as going to a prayer meeting, a dance, or visits with families and lovers, were understood as having to be stolen. This produces a helpful and liberating contradiction for, quote, property can't steal property, end quote. In looting themselves and in, quote, stealing away, end quote, the enslaved not only abolished themselves as property, but also pointed to the absurd paradox implicit in property itself. The act, Hartman notes, challenges and threatens the entire regime. It, quote, reconsiders the meaning of property, theft, and agency, end quote. However, much like a single riot or a single instance of looting does not in itself endanger the system of property, a single fugitive did not in herself threaten the total system of slavery. Robin Blackburn argues that, quote, to run away could still impose a cost, but a very unequal one. The owner lost the value of the slave, but was rid of a problem, end quote. Of course, the power of the owner is crucial. A CVS store is certain to be riot insured and operating with a huge margin, whereas a struggling business might not be able to afford an extended closure and thus could be ruined by a riot. Similarly, a large plantation owner might be okay with seeing his most rebellious property away, whereas a small white farmer who enslaved only one or two people might be ruined. And though individual enslavers might do whatever they could to recapture a fugitive, some of them understood that, as a class, owners benefited from the way escapees functioned to relieve pressure within the plantation. Individual instances of rioting and looting can similarly have a medium-term positive effect for the regime of racial capitalism if they are not soon repeated or taken further, instead functioning as, quote, safety valves, end quote, diffusing anger and releasing tension. But this benefit is utterly lost in the long sweep of history. Just as riots and uprisings produce a new generation of revolutionaries, so too did the fugitives provide the basis for the abolition movement of the antebellum period. As W.E.B. Du Bois writes in Black Reconstruction, quote, not only was the fugitive slave important because of the actual loss involved, but for potentialities in the future. These free Negroes were furnishing a leadership for the mass of the black workers, and especially they were furnishing a text for the abolition idealist. Fugitive slaves increased the number of abolitionists by thousands and spelled the doom of slavery. End quote. This doom was finally brought upon the South at the height of the Civil War. From 1861 to 1865, 500,000 slaves escaped the plantations, throwing down tools and often crossing Union lines to emancipation. As many as 200,000 of them served in the Union Army. It is this incredible act of revolution that will both decide the war and give it its meaning. Du Bois called this moment the general strike of the slaves. Excuse me. This tremendous political action, this general strike, this mass looting did not appear from nothing or materialize, quote, opportunistically, end quote, in the face of war. Indeed, by 1860, before the general strike began, the number of escapes had reached perhaps 50,000 annually, many of those escapees staying in maroon or free black communities in the South, and some escaping for only a short time, meaning the general strike was an acceleration and intensification of a movement already in process. The number of fugitives steadily grew from 1830 onward, with a marked increase in militancy after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Fugitives played a crucial role in the end of slavery well before their great revolutionary moment. In the face of the movement of ever-increasing maroonage, the Democratic Party pushed the Fugitive Slave Act into the Compromise of 1850. This law was a central component of the political crisis that led to the outbreak of the Civil War. The act not only made harboring a fugitive in a free state a federal crime, not only gave slave catchers jurisdiction over the entire North, not only removed any legal proceedings beyond the enslaver's testimony, but also obliged all citizens to actively participate in capturing fugitives. This law didn't stem the tide of fugitives, but it did galvanize the abolition movement, which grew increasingly militant in the face of the law's overreach. Across the North, former slaves and free people armed themselves and started speaking not just of abolition, but of revolution. And it convinced many northern white politicians, intellectuals, and capitalists of the fearful rise of the great, quote, slave power, end quote, and anxiety not about slavery itself, but about a lack of northern political sovereignty within the federal government. This fear helped lead to the rise of the Republican Party and the political crisis that would become secession. And so that wraps us up on that page, gets us to page 46. Okay, let's read this last little sentence of page 46. And so the fugitive, finding her emancipation by escaping the plantation, pulled the tides of history toward emancipation for all. Okay, so then that gets us to 3 more of those matches, which again I believe is sort of like a changing of topic a little bit. And so one of the things I want to speak about is, hold on one second, it's getting the wind's starting to blow. It's getting a little chillier. This has been the least warm summer I've ever experienced. Here come the weak ass police. Fuck the police. Anyways. So in that portion there, I think one of the things that is important to point out or to double back on is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the Democratic Party pushed the Fugitive Slave Act into the Compromise of 1850. And so that's one of the things that I think we have to continue to remember, and that's the further back you go, the easier it is to remember this. But each party, whether it be Democratic or Republican, has been the enemy of the black community, have done things that, what's up, brother, have done things that were disadvantageous for the black community because they were politically advantageous for the party. And so I think that's why we cannot consider ourselves as a black community, as black people, to be Democrat or to be Republican. We must be black people first. We must put our power or our pressure or our force behind whichever party is going to do the thing that is collectively best for the black community, that is collectively best for black people. Because again, historically, neither one of these parties have been pro-black life. They've been, pro winning their election. They've been pro continuing to keep their seats. They've been pro-power. And so we have to have that same mindset. We have to be pro-power. And that was one of the things that when the origins of the term Black Power originated, one of the things that the people in that Black liberation movement of that time were preaching and speaking was power, was political power, was wielding power in the streets and wielding powers in the ballot. And so I think that that's one of the things that pops out to me is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. I think the specifics that they talked about in this Fugitive Slave Act and how suppressive or how repressive the things that they wanted in this act were the things that they pushed through in this act were egregiously repressive. And I think that we have to be reminded that, and this was something that I heard said by a revolutionary in the 60s. I can't remember who specifically, but that repression brings the masses of people together. And that is something that has happened. But he says the repression was H. Rap Brown. He said repression brings the masses of people together, but it becomes the job of the vanguard to not wait for that repression to bring people together. And so you see here that when they passed this Fugitive Slave Act, that it was such a repressive nature that it brought more people together, that it was the movement of abolition was moving forward at such a strong pace, at such a was moving forward at such a strong pace that this could not stop it. This could not slow it down. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind, again, as we're moving forward with this struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, is that historically America has never just done the humane thing or done the right thing. The institutions have always struggled against doing the humane thing or doing the right thing. America did not welcome the ending of slavery. It struggled against the ending of slavery. America did not welcome even the token desegregation that came in the 60s. It struggled against it. And the same thing will happen here. America will not welcome and embrace the ending of police terrorism. It will not welcome and embrace the ending of mass incarceration. It will not welcome and embrace the ending of racial injustice. It's going to struggle against those things. And so we cannot let ourselves be fooled into thinking striking one blow is defeating the monster of an institution that we're dealing with. And that has to be reminded by seeing the constant struggle that it was to end slavery. And I think that is one of the things that that's being highlighted as I go through and read through this again is the constant struggle that it was to end slavery and the constant back and forth that it was to end slavery. Okay, so we're on page 46 of In Defense of Looting. We're not going to get through this chapter in this read. Not going to get through this chapter. Oh, yeah, we're not going to get through it. This is a big chapter. All right, this is a big chapter. Okay. Let's continue, though. Page 46. Fugitives on the eve of the Civil War were drawing on a tradition of revolt and resistance that was hundreds of years old. Across the Americas, throughout the centuries, the sleep of white plantation owners, merchants, and governors was made fitful by the nightmare of slave revolt. The enslaved, armed with guns, hoes, and scythes, flaming torches, and unimpeachable vengeance, marched unceasingly across their unconscious. As the years progressed, these dreams took on a less spectral and more nameable shape. Toussaint L'Ouverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Gabriel, Haiti, Bahia, Stono, Amistad. Violent insurrections were only the most spectacular form of resistance. Poisoning enslavers, their kin, and their livestock, sabotaging equipment, and burning buildings to the ground were common night terrors of the enslaver. Suicide was also a common, tragic form of struggle against the slave regime. Less dramatic, more everyday resistances abounded. Working slowly and inexpertly, pretending ignorance or incomprehension, despite the widespread use of the hoe in African agriculture, oversleeping, and other ways of rejecting the enslaver's labor regime and lowering his profits were practiced wherever Africans were enslaved. The most reliable form of resistance was flight. The very first known enslaved Africans in what would become the United States, kidnapped and brought to a small Spanish colony in the area of the Carolinas around 1526, revolted, escaped their bondage, and lived out their lives among indigenous tribes. Flight was not always permanent. The record is full of the enslaved leaving only to visit family members and friends on nearby plantations, to attend social events and religious gatherings, or sometimes to strike, refusing to return to the plantation until demands were met. I think that one of the things that isn't spoken about enough is the struggle that slaves did, or that slaves had against their masters and against the, I don't like using the word master, but that slaves had while they were in the plantation or on the plantation. I think that that's something that is not spoken about at the. I think that's something that is not spoken enough about, and I think it's done purposely because if the history of slavery was told more accurately in this country, and if the amount of true terroristic nature of slavery was told more often, it would call into question what type of country do we live in that we allow these things to continue to happen. It's one thing if you just think these bad things happen to slaves and you only see these slaves as victims, but it becomes a different thing when you start to see the full spectrum of how many slaves did run away, and how many slaves did struggle, and how many slaves did kill their masters, and did use violence as a manner to. And again, I don't like the idea of the person that's in self-defense being considered using violence, but that defended their lives with force against people who are using violence to try to rid them of their freedom. And I think that is the true history of slavery in America. It is of a victimization, it is of a traumatization, but it is also of a rebelling, of a fighting, of a struggling back. It was never a time in this nation and in this country in which black people have routinely laid down and dealt with the ills that were being cast upon them by white power structures and by white society. Okay, that puts us at the bottom of page 46. I think that's good for right now. I gotta use the bathroom. I think this was a good read. We knocked some pages out. I'm gonna try to hop back in, do some more a little bit later on. Again, I want to try to, as often as possible, continue to continue to be reading through the pieces of literature and expounding on how the things that are in the books relate to the issues that we're facing here in Rockford, Illinois. So I'm going to end this one the way we end the way that we end the lives, and I'm going to say rest in power to Demetrius Bennett, rest in power to Logan Bell, rest in power to Kerry Blake, rest in power to Geno Washington, rest in power to Jovan Fresco. What's up? Rest in power to Mark Barmore, rest in power to Philip Johnson, rest in power to Jasper Banks, rest in power to Suzette Babler, rest in power to Faustin Guaitigo, rest in power to Shannon Graves, rest in power to Lil Mike Sago, rest in power to Joseph McCormick, rest in power to Eddie Patterson, and rest in power to Mikey Guzman. We outside.